Hey, I'm Daniel and welcome back to another Elder Scrolls Betrayal of the Second Era video, and today we're talking all about the Sorcerer class, a powerful spellcaster with a focus on elemental damage and some dark abilities. As always in my class guide videos, I'll be covering everything you need to know about this class, how their abilities work, how and when to upgrade to the master side, which races pair well with them, what starting skill line to choose, what additional skill lines offer good synergy and what items can enhance the build. And finally, I'll show a bit of gameplay so you could get a sense of how the class actually plays and feels at the table. I'll put timestamps in the description if you want to jump ahead, although I would really appreciate if you stick around for the whole thing. Now, a quick disclaimer: I think figuring things out for yourself is one of the most rewarding parts in this game, and I would encourage everyone to experiment and find their own playstyle. That said, the game can feel a bit overwhelming at first, so this guide is here to help you get started and understand how the class works. And if you're already a seasoned player, I hope you can still find something interesting here too. And now let's get into the guide. Alright, so let's start off with the Sorcerer class sheet, and I'm gonna start off with the Novice side and then I'm gonna flip over to Master to talk through that as well. So the innate ability is if you start your turn in a magic battle form, you gain 1 tenacity. Tenacity is a very powerful resource in the game, not only to trigger the class abilities, but also to pass some various checks, and quests sometimes require you to spend different amount of tenacity, so just having more tenacity is great. Of course, the usefulness of tenacity for different classes can vary depending on the class abilities, but the good news is for Sorcerer that those class abilities are awesome. And starting your turn in magic battle form is also really easy because you're pretty much gonna spend your entire time in magic battle form, so yeah, it's kinda like passive 1 tenacity for free all the time pretty much. So the first class ability is Power Surge. Spend any amount of additional tenacity, choose an adventurer to recover the leftmost number of dice from their cooldown track to the additional amount spent. I think this text might be a little bit confusing for beginners, at least it certainly was for me the first time I read this text, but basically you just spend 1 tenacity to kinda activate this class ability, even though it doesn't have any effect on its own. However, for any extra tenacity that you spend, you can recover leftmost number of dice from your cooldown track. So essentially, you spend in a minimum of 2 tenacity to recover 1 die, and all the way up to 5 tenacity to recover 4 dice. And this effect is obviously very powerful. There are many situations where you're absolutely happy to recover some extra dice, whether it's some nasty status die or just your extra skill dice that you want to use to finish off some nasty enemy. Lots of situations where this is really helpful, and I really like especially that it's very flexible because you can choose the different amount of tenacity that you can spend to recover different amount of dice. So again, the flexibility and the use cases of this particular ability are just absolutely amazing. The next ability is Lightning Splash. Interrupt after you defeat an enemy, deal 2 damage to every unit that was in that enemy's range. And well, let me show you how it works. So the way Lightning Splash works on the Novice side is the following. Let's say I'm dealing the last bit of damage to this Wood Elf Marauder, is about to be defeated, and at this moment the trigger kind of works on the Lightning Splash because it says interrupt after you defeat an enemy. You can deal 2 damage to every unit that was in that enemy's range. Because the Wood Elf Marauder has a range of 1, it means that 2 damage would go only to adjacent enemies, which means in this case only Breton Marauder would be affected. However, things get a little bit more spicy when you use this on an enemy that has a higher range. Let's say if I defeat this High Elf Marauder with a range of 4, and then I would use my Lightning Splash, that means all units in the range of 4, which means of this unit's range, would get 2 damage. So that's basically the entire clash. Range 4 is obviously huge, and because it says all units, it means all allies would defeat damage, like companions and party members, and yourself you would take damage, so this can absolutely wipe your entire party if you are not intentional and not cautious with this ability. Next class ability is Unholy Knowledge for 2 tenacity if you are in magic battle form. Roll any 1 status die in any adventurer's cooldown track and place it back in the same position with the new result. Now this is a bit tricky one because you're rolling the die, which means the result is still random. You can have the same thing or you can get something even worse potentially. So generally speaking, I would frankly avoid using this ability altogether unless you are at some really desperate moment, like let's say you're sitting at just 1 health and you have some nasty Bane die sitting at the end of your cooldown track and you desperately really need to get rid of it somehow at least. So you're hoping to reroll this at least to any other effect pretty much. And yeah, that's probably like the only use case I could see. Maybe potentially if you have fear status die, which is also pretty nasty because you can't use anything else except your combat dice, and there is not much use of combat dice for sorcerers, so that could be the case again. But yeah, other than that, I would pretty much avoid, just not use the Unholy Knowledge. The next class ability is Dark Exchange. For 3 tenacity, if you are in magic battle form, remove 1 HP from yourself and from any unit in range, add both chips to any other unit in range, and that health may exceed health stat. And this is a bit tricky one as well, so let me show you how it works. So the way Dark Exchange works on the Novice side is the following. Let's say this is our character, this is our Orc companion, and this is a Wood Elf bandit and enemy. So we spend in 3 tenacity, and if we are in the magic battle form, we're moving 1 health chip from our character, we're removing 1 health chip from another unit, and then we move both health chips to any other unit. And the word other is the key because there has to be a 3rd unit, whether it's an enemy, although it would be a bit ridiculous to buffing up enemies, so we have to move this basically to another companion that we have. If we are playing in solo, however, without the companion at all, we basically just can't use this ability. And the last but not least ability is Blood Magic. For 4 tenacity, if you're in magic battle form, each adventurer in play heals to full HP, then gains light fatigue equal to the amount of HP healed. Light fatigue that cannot be placed does not generate over fatigue. This might be the most powerful healing ability in the game, because not only you heal into full health, which is especially very relevant, especially in the end game when you have your health stat increase maybe up to 7 or 8 or potentially even more, but you're also healing the entire party, so each adventurer in play heals to full health. Particularly for Sorcerer, this is very helpful in the early game, where you don't have a lot of damage and sometimes you take in damage and maybe sometimes you inflicting damage yourself depending on your skill line, so being able to heal to full health is absolutely amazing. The downside of gaining light fatigue for the amount healed, I would say, isn't that bad. Generally speaking, it's okay to have some light fatigue in your cooldown track. It's not as bad as over fatigue, and you can even remove this later on and even potentially in the same round using Power Surge. So again, generally speaking, I would say the trade-off of healing but gaining light fatigue is worth it. Now let's talk about the upgrading requirements to get the Master Sorcerer, which says have party size plus 2 enchantments active at the same time. And well, there are a couple of things you need to know about this. So first of all, enchantments are different types of items, they called glyphs or something, and this is how they look like. Now the important thing about it is that they all have different timing of their effects. For example, this particular glyph says discard this enchantment when the enemy is defeated. Another enchantment basically can discard this at any time. And another one, it says, when the enchanted adventurer deals damage, discard this enchantment. And so for the purpose of this class ability, you must have party size plus 2 enchantments active at the same time, but since they all have different timing, my best piece of advice would be just to keep all these enchantment items in your backpack until you have the right amount and then play them all at the same time. This is the guaranteed way to fulfill the requirements and become Master Sorcerer all at once, and also keep in mind that those enchantments have to be in play and it doesn't matter who exactly play them, so if you're playing with more than one player, it doesn't matter who plays them as long as these enchantments are active at the same time. Now, in terms of the upgrade priority, when you should be doing it and whether it's worth doing this at all, I would say generally speaking this heavily varies from class to class. For some of them it's a must, for some of them it's okay to kind of stay on the Novice side even for the rest or for the entire game. But I would say for Sorcerer, the power level between the Novice and the Master side is probably one of the most impactful in the entire game. Just so much class ability changing and they become much more powerful. So for Sorcerer specifically, I would say definitely make this as your first priority, upgrading to your Master side, even potentially more than beginning some experience and level up the die. I would say it's even worth spending a couple of the first day of the game visiting different towns to see what's available on the market, and if you have a chance to get some enchantments there, that would be amazing, even though generally speaking I would kind of avoid going to different towns because I would generally speaking again prefer gaining some experience either from peaceful or combat encounters, and you're obviously not gaining any experience from a town encounter. However, if you will manage to upgrade to a Sorcerer side, to a Master side earlier in the game, that would be a huge boost for your entire game. So what's changing and why upgrading to a master side is so good? Let's find out by flipping the card to a master side. And first of all, the innate ability changes slightly. If you start it on in Magic battle form, gain 1 tenacity or remove light 1 fatigue from your cooldown track. Now, generally speaking, between the two, I prefer to gain 1 tenacity most of the time because their class abilities are just so good. But being able to remove 1 light fatigue when you need it is really good. It's again just extra flexibility that you have, which is really nice. The first ability, Power Surge, changes in a way that it recovers +1 extra die. So if on the Novice side you would spend at least a minimum of 2 tenacity to recover just 1 die, on the Master side for the same 2 tenacity you recover already 2 dice, which are definitely more cost efficient. The next ability, Lightning Splash, now deals damage only to the enemies, so no longer all units, which means your companions, your adventurers, your fellow party members and yourself are safe from the Lightning Splash, so you can now use it more freely and more safely. And this is especially great in the early game when you mostly encounter level 1 and level 5 enemies, where they typically have a little bit less defense, which means this Lightning Splash just deals more damage, more efficient. So yeah, this is why I would say upgrading to a master side, especially early on, is really beneficial. Next is Unholy Knowledge, and it changes in a way that it now allows you to choose a side of the die, which changes everything about this ability. It's basically changing from just avoid using this ability altogether unless it's emergency, to just becoming a really handy and useful ability to have in your toolkit. There is a certain skill dice, which we're gonna talk about in a moment, which you're probably gonna use, and then it forces you to get a blind status in your cooldown track, and so with Unholy Knowledge, you can just change that nasty blind to a stealth, because stealth is the only positive side of the status die, and there are just many other effects, like when enemies applying fear, again a really nasty thing, you can just essentially remove it in a way for just 3 tenacity. So very flexible tool, very useful tool, especially in the end game where there are more status dying like Bane or Fear, and yeah, just super useful. And next is Dark Exchange, and the upgraded version of this Dark Exchange is my absolutely favorite ability of Sorcerer. And again, just let me show you how it works. Unlike on the Novice side, where we have to move those health chips to any other unit, the wording of Dark Exchange on the Master side says that we can move up to 2 chips from any unit in range to any other unit in range. So basically it doesn't have to be our character, we can move them, let's say from this Wood Elf Bandit, both 2 health chips to our companion if we want to, but we could also move this to our character, and this can also work even if we play without a companion at all, so just 1 enemy and 1 our character. We can just basically heal for 2 health in a sense, and removing those 2 health from those enemy as well. And because it's a health removal, it's so strong, it goes kind of through all the enemy defense, because you're not really attacking them, and defense can only block an attack from engage, and this is just moving health chips, it's a different effect. So yeah, this is why it's just so powerful. And because it only costs 3 tenacity and you gain 1 tenacity for free, you can use it almost every turn, at least every other turn for sure. You're basically just moving 2 health from any other character, which is enemy unit, typically with the most amount of defense, and you're moving this to your character, and this health can exceed your maximum health stat, which is absolutely insane. Sometimes you get a huge tower of health for your character. This is just so good. Just keep in mind that at the end of battle, this extra health exceeding your health stat is removed, but at least during the battle, yeah, it just stays there and acts as your shield, as your defense, as your heal. It's just so good. One of my absolute favorite ability of Sorcerer. And the last but not least, the upgraded version of Blood Magic, it now costs 5 instead of 4, which I would say is a rare case of upping the cost instead of reducing it, but it's a very understandably so, because it's not only healing you to full HP and your entire party just like before, but instead of now adding light fatigue for the amount of healed, you're removing that amount of light fatigue from your cooldown track, which is absolutely insane. Now let's pick a race for our Sorcerer, and the first option I would consider is Khajiit. Now, Khajiits don't have particular predisposition to magic. Starting 2 Magicka is kinda in the middle, it's okay. However, the class ability, which allows you to succeed at the lockpick automatically, allows you to gain more items, potentially more legendary items easily, and those items can be enchantments, and enchantments is an easy way to get to the master side quickly. As already explained, upgrading from a novice to a master sorcerer side is a tremendous boost in power, and Khajiit is definitely the best race to speed up this process and help you along the way. The next race option I would consider is Breton. Now, Bretons have a starting magicka of 3, which is definitely much better, also 5 health, help especially in the early game to mitigate some early damage. And the class ability is just generally speaking very useful because there are so many overattacks effects that can be useful. Now, Bretons have a starting magicka of 3, which is definitely much better. They also have a starting health of 5, which again helps a lot, especially in the early game, to mitigate some damage or even self-damage, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And their class ability is very strong once you get a good weapon or an armor slot. Now, that being said, the very first combat you're going to encounter, you likely won't be able to use the class ability at all, because it's very unlikely that you're going to have a good weapon or an armor right away. And even if the market on the very first day of the town encounter has some good items, you're still going to likely want to pick enchantments if you have that option, again, just to upgrade to a master side quickly. So again, this class ability is very useful, but mostly in the late game or even in the very end game once you have already found a really decent piece of armor or a weapon. The next race option to consider is High Elf. High Elves have the starting magicka of 4, which is the highest value out of all races, which seems like an obvious choice for many magicka users, and particularly for Sorcerer, and also the racial ability of allowing them to heal for 3 health whenever you want to, once per battle, kinda heal on demand, is really synergistic with some of the early game dice that we're gonna use soon, and you'll see why in a moment. However, from my experience, once you get to the mid game or especially in the late game, you practically don't need to use the class ability at all, because you rarely need heal whatsoever, just because you have so many extra health that exceeding your health stats thanks to the Dark Exchange that you're using all the time, which essentially is a heal. So I would say High Elf is probably the best choice for beginners and for early game, but maybe not so much for the late game. And the last race I would pick for Sorcerer is a Dark Elf. Now, Dark Elves have a starting magicka of 3, which is obviously less than High Elves 4, and it's similar to Breton of also 3. However, unlike Breton, they also have 2 combat dice, which, believe it or not, might help especially in the early game to get some damage rolling. Khajiits also have the same number of combat dice, however they have 3 stamina, while Dark Elves have 3 magicka, which I think just by looking at the stats, I think this is just all-rounded better, like more balanced way of starting a Sorcerer. Dark Elf's racial ability is also very powerful. You can recover any up to 4 skill dice from your cooldown track, replacing them with Light Fatigue, and remember that we can remove Light Fatigue using either Power Surge or Blood Magic, so there is a lot of synergy going on between Sorcerer class abilities and Dark Elf racial ability, and I also just personally think it kind of fits thematically with this kind of dark wizardy thing going on there. So my advice would be to pick either High Elf or Khajiit if you want to have a little easier time in the beginning, because Khajiit can allow you to upgrade to Master Side potentially easy, and High Elf, they're a little bit more beginner friendly because they can allow you to recover from damage taken or self-damage taken, which we're going to talk again about in a moment. Or I would say pick Breton or Dark Elf if you want to have a little bit more advantage in the late game. There is absolutely no right and wrong in this game, and you can safely pick any race you want, but for the purpose of this video I'm gonna pick Dark Elf. Alright, we've got our class, we've got our race, now it's time to build our character, and the first question is where do we want to put the initial attribute stat tokens. As you probably know, attributes that are sitting across each other, they are limiting the way they can level up either of those, because they kind of meet in the middle, so it's best to have kind of picture in advance how far you want to level up a certain stat or a certain skill lines, because you can't change those things later in the game. First things first, I'm gonna put on the health stat token on the top left corner, for no particular reason, frankly I just prefer to have it on this spot. And the first real question comes, where do we want to put magicka? Because I know that I definitely want to level up magicka, potentially up to 5, so I'd be able to roll more magicka skill dice in a single engage or spellcasting at a longer distance. I would probably put my magicka stat on its own row, alongside with its 3 basic stat tokens. The next question is where do we want to put a stamina stat token? Let's say if I put it on the 3rd row underneath the magic stat over here, and because we start with 2 stamina, that means that a potential skill line that I'm gonna put across on the same row will be limited to only 4 skill dice. And you know what, I think for this particular build I'm probably gonna use at least 2 more skill lines that I want to level up with maybe 5 dice. So my best choice would be probably to put this either across Magicka or Health, and if I were to put this across Magicka, because we're starting with 2 stamina, again that means my Magicka will be limited to only 4, and as already mentioned I would definitely want to level up Magicka higher than that, potentially up to 5, so I think my best option would be just to put this across Health, with 2 corresponding attribute stat tokens. Now I would say most classes need to have at least 4 stamina just for extra mobility to move further, which is especially helpful to pick up some cash loots or to move further in delves. However, because we're going to pick a particular skin line that will grant us a little bit more extra mobility, I think we would be okay to just level up stamina for 1 more point over here, which means we're gonna leave room for improving health for up to 7, which is just perfect. The next similar question is where do we want to put a combat skill line token, and I think I have a good idea of putting this across stamina, just like so. And there are a couple of particular reasons why I prefer to put combat skill line on this particular slot. First of all, it leaves the other 2 rows completely open for more skill lines, which we're gonna talk about in a moment. Secondly, I know that I'm not gonna leveling up more combat skill dice for sure. And thirdly, even when I start leveling up Magicka, let's say if I get my new magic attribute stat token over here, I'm still not quite clashing yet. And even by the time I choose to keep my 5th Magicka stat, I can just at this point already untrain 1 combat dice, so it's not a big deal. Finally, I'm gonna set up the cooldown value of 2 by moving the peg to the number 2, and we're good to go with choosing the starting skill line. For the starting skill line, as you can probably already guessed, I'm gonna pick Distraction Staff alongside its 2 starting Force Shock dice. Now this die is pretty tricky because 2 of its side deal 1 true damage to any 1 adventurer, and if you're playing with a big party of 3 other adventurers, that gets slightly easier because you can kind of spread the damage, but if you are playing true solo with just 1 character, this is pretty severe. 2 sides that deal damage to any 1 adventurer is a roughly 33% chance of just getting those results whenever you roll this die, so you're gonna see those pretty often, and so you will occasionally take damage. And this is why I said that High Elf is slightly easier pick in the beginning, just because of the racial ability allows you to heal through health just to kinda restore after this true damage inflicted to adventurer. Remember that after rolling the die, you can choose not to resolve a particular die, let's say if you want to avoid taking extra unnecessary damage, but yeah, those couple of early fights, that can be pretty rough. This is why, as I already mentioned, starting with 2 combat dice can really help you a lot in this very early combats. It is much better than starting with just 1 like High Elf does, because they can really help you to just deal a little bit of extra damage here and there. However, remember that you can't roll together Magicka skill die and combat skill die, because combat skill die require a different battle form, either ranged or melee, or sometimes you can even use this as a defense if needed. But yeah, other than that, just use it at your advantage. Those early fights when you have just a skill shock, the force shock skill dice are pretty rough. Moving on to the level 2, we have a choice of 2 different skill dice, Wall of Elements and Destructive Touch. Now, I will say right away that Destructive Touch is probably a little bit more stronger, because instantly defeating enemies is obviously a very powerful effect, especially if you can just instantly remove a level 5 enemy. And even when you apply Bane status to any adventurer, remember that on the master side you can just freely choose to change this status die result from Bane to, let's say, Stealth, which is obviously just great. However, the second die result, which deals damage to adventurer equals to the HP of the defeated enemy, is just very, very punishing. And keep in mind that it has 3 sides of this die, so it's basically 50% chance of just taking, I don't know, whatever, 5, 6, 7 health damage to adventurer. And again, it may be not as bad when you're playing with 4 other adventurers, so you can spread the damage, kind of equally divide among them as you choose. However, when you're playing solo, this is just too much. You basically just can't take that much damage, because you would be instantly defeat yourself as well. So for this reason, and because most of my guides are generally speaking more focused on the solo players for solo builds and solo playthroughs, I'm gonna choose a Wall of Elements. Now, a couple of things to know about Wall of Elements. First of all, these dice are drained, so basically just a one-time use in a battle. Secondly, you can apply them to any enemies in range, and it doesn't have anything about target, which means you can target one enemy, let's say with your force shock dice or any other dice, and just roll alongside a wall of elements and then apply to any other enemies around it, so this is actually very useful. Daze is actually an okay status, especially against melee enemies, because you essentially shut them down for a turn because they move and they can't attack anymore if they moved, so it's again a little bit nice defensive option. Maim is pretty decent too, especially once you get to enemies that roll 3 or 4 combat dice. Trust me, you'd be very happy to have this die on certain enemies that hit very strong otherwise. But the last result is Fear is absolutely amazing, if you manage to get that. Fear is the ultimate solution against some of the nastiest enemy affixes, skills like Stalwart or Necromancy or Fear or some other things that just really nasty, and you can completely shut them down using this die. Again, if you manage to get the result, which is a bit tricky, but it is what it is. Frankly, I'm not a big fan of Wall of Elements dice in general, but simply because Destructive Touch is just make it impossible in solo play, we're gonna pick Wall of Elements. Moving on to the level 3, we have 3 different dice options: Pulsar, Elemental Drain, and Elemental Rage. And let me start with the third option first, Elemental Rage. The way it works, you're basically selecting a cache in range and kind of blowing it up and then making area damage to enemies around it. Now, it can deal potentially up to 7 damage, which is probably the strongest, the most damage dealing single die in the game. I think this is a really strong die and it's certainly a very fun die, but I personally have a couple of issues with that. And the first one is obvious that you need to have a cache in play in order to just roll and resolve this effect. Sometimes there could be simply no caches in range, or sometimes all those caches perhaps might be used for some different quest objective or as quest enemies essentially, so you can't blow them up like that. So it's getting a little bit tricky sometimes. Also sometimes the positioning can be a little bit tricky, because sometimes caches are located behind enemies, and because enemies are generally speaking moving towards adventurers, they're kind of moving away from those cache chips, so even if there is a cache chip that you can blow up, even if you are in range to that, sometimes simply enemies are not, and again making the use a little bit tricky. And lastly, sometimes, well, you just want items, you know, items are very powerful things in the game, and you don't always want to just blow up those caches. So really strong, really fun dice, but I'm probably gonna skip it for this particular build. Next is Elemental Drain, and it's a pretty interesting one. First of all, when you roll and apply this die, it doesn't do anything on its own, it's just sitting on top of the enemy, and yeah, it just basically does nothing. However, as soon as that enemy is defeated, this die is jumping on the next target or next adjacent target and dealing 2 true damage. So it's almost like a damage over time effect, simulated with this die, which I really like how it's implemented. I think it's very clever. And the best thing is that even when this die, when there is no adjacent enemy to kind of trigger, this dice is just recovered back to your adventure map, so it's not exhausted, it's not drained, you can apply it over and over again if needed. I think the best use case for this die is applying to the weakest enemy, ideally surrounded by some other strongest enemy, and then you kind of focusing on that enemy to defeat it quicker, and so the Elemental Drain die would then jump to other enemies, one at a time, and yeah, because it's dealing true damage, it's very effective against some really strongest high defensive enemies. However, even though this die is great, it's a little bit slow because it's damage over time, and we want a little bit more direct damage that we can just apply more consistently, and so we're gonna skip Elemental Drain for now and focus on Pulsar. So Pulsar deals 2 true damage to your target on one side, and on the other side it deals 2 true damage as well as 1 true damage to each adjacent unit to your target. In both cases, the targets get blind status die as well as you get blind yourself. And I must say right away that this is probably one of the strongest die in the entire game. First of all, it deals true damage. So let's say if you are engaging an enemy with 3 defense, it's dealing 2 true damage is essentially as if you're dealing 5 normal damage, so this is just pure math on its own, it's really strong. But then you're applying blind, and blind is kinda okay when you're playing in 4 players, because there are just lots of units all around the board, and sometimes they're hitting each other, and sometimes when there are just the battlefield is so crowded, it doesn't matter if the target is blinded or not. However, when you're playing especially in solo, this blind is just absolutely ridiculous. Sometimes, if you're lucky and apply this to all adjacent units with the secondary result, they all get blinded, and you can just safely stand aside while they completely annihilating each other. This is ridiculously good. Of course, you can then apply blind yourself, but because we have unholy knowledge that allows you to freely change the status die to the side of your choice, you just basically have an amazing die that is super strong, it deals direct true damage, and applying blind and almost without any downsides. Let's say you are engaging with this enemy, High Elf Marauder, and you're rolling this side of the die. That means they are taking 2 true damage, as well as gaining a status die of blind, and as well as you get the blindness yourself. Keep in mind that in your cooldown track, it goes after all dice that resolve with this engage, because it says after the engage, which is a little bit worse, because this means that this die will stay a little bit longer in your cooldown track. However, let's say if you are rolled this result instead, not only the adjacent enemies would also take 1 true damage, so they would all be removed. Extra damage. Obviously you get blind as well, and that means they all get blind as well. And this is just turns this encounter in the complete show, because they basically just hitting each other, because remember, blind enemy can only target adjacent strongest unit, and they all treat all units as the opposite units, so they're basically fighting each other while you can just standing still here safely. Even though when you are blinded, that basically doesn't matter, you can go safely, pick up some loot while they're fighting. So yeah, this is getting absolutely hilarious, and yeah, one of my favorite die in the game. So yeah, definitely an easy pick for me. It's gonna be a Pulsar die, just like so. And next we have a very interesting choice of either training some of the remaining level 3 dice, Elemental Drain or Elemental Rage, or training a level 4 die, Ancient Knowledge. Now, Ancient Knowledge deals 1 damage and heals you for 1 HP for every available skill dice. First of all, remember that available means they only available for rolling, which means they are sitting on your adventure mat, not in your cooldown, and not drained. And also the die itself is drained, so it's again only 1-time use. Because of how the damage and the healing scales with the number of dice you have, these die get even better over time once you train even more magic skill dice, so in that sense it would be probably more wiser to train it later in the game and maybe take a level 3 die first. But frankly, I just love the fact that it's healing on demand. It allows you again to just mitigate some of the potential self-harm inflicted from the Force Shock level 1 dice, or just whenever you need a little bit of extra healing. So for this reason, I always like to pick it first, even though you might have only it might be just not dealing as much damage at first as it could later in the game. So yeah, first I'm gonna take Ancient Knowledge and slot it right here. And for the final and 6th slot of the skill line, the question is whether do we even want to train another skill line, and my answer is yes. First of all, because Ancient Knowledge scales with the number of available skill dice, so in that sense, the more we have, the better. And also, I think we still need a little bit more damage, particularly true damage, because so far only Pulsar deals true damage, and we might otherwise have a little bit trouble time against some really defensive, high defense enemies. And so for this reason, I'm gonna get back to Elemental Drain and pick it as the last skill die of this skill line. And now let's have a look what other skill lines can be complementary and work nicely alongside for this particular build and this class. Now, when it comes to training your secondary skill lines beyond your first starting skill lines, the very first thing to keep in mind, and there is the general acquisition of those secondary skill lines, it's a bit random. It's obviously up to the draw from the skill line bag when you visit in a town. So this is why it's a good idea to kind of get a sense of general understanding when it's time to pick some certain skill lines. For example, if you see a certain skill line, you're probably best to pick it right away the moment you see this, and some others can just wait and see. So just weighting your options, kind of knowing what the kind of different routes you might take is really beneficial. When it comes to Sorcerer, I think the very first kind of secondary skill line you can think of is Restoring Light. Restoring Light is obviously a healing skill line, and if you think about 2 first starting dice of your Destruction Stuff skill line, where you inflict damage to adventurers, it kind of makes sense to get some little bit of extra healing. So this is a pretty decent option, and I would say especially if you are playing in a party with other adventurers, with especially up to maybe even 4 adventurers, then this Restoring Light is get a little bit better, because you kind of more beneficial to have some extra healing, at least for some of the adventurers. So yeah, it's just a good party skill, I would say. However, when you're playing solo, this might be a little bit an overkill or an overheal, because just the Sorcerer has already so many different healings built in from the class abilities themselves. For example, Dark Exchange is it's not quite straight healing, but I'm thinking about it as a healing ability because you're removing chips from other units and then moving this onto your chip. So yeah, it's essentially heal 2 that you can do almost every turn because it costs 3 tenacity and you gain 1 tenacity for free. So it's like every other turn, if you will, you gain into 2 health. So yeah, it's almost like heal, and so in that sense, Restoring Light kind of becomes a little bit less efficient because you just simply don't need healing whatsoever. And for the moments when you actually need some real proper heal, when you're low on health, there is also Blood Magic that you can restore your full health with just a single class ability. So yeah, this is why I think Restoring Light is a decent option when you play it in group, but slightly less so appealing when you're playing in solo. The next skill line option is Daedric Summoning. It's another Magicka type skill line, so it kind of makes sense to combine them together, and especially if you are playing solo, having some extra party member in a form of a summons, the Golf Companions, they're pretty good, and especially since you can use Dark Exchange to move health chips not only under your adventure, but to any other unit, which means you can kind of beef up your companions, make them a little bit more tankier, so this is good. However, I would probably say that there are some other classes that's kind of slightly maybe better for this Daedric Summoning skill line in general, with the only exception that there is just one particular skill dice on just level 2 that is really nice for Sorcerer, but you know what, just for now we're going to leave this aside because we will consider this as a kind of second option, and we'll get back to this in a moment, you'll see why. The next secondary skill line option to consider is Illusion. Keep in mind though that this particular skill line comes only with the Valenwood expansion, so if you don't have access to it, I would then say probably consider having a little bit of mix of Daedric Summoning and Restoring Light. However, for Illusion is really another good option for party play, because it gives more control on the enemies, some particular skill dice that can almost entirely kind of shut down certain enemies, especially ranged enemies, and just having a little bit tricks on the battlefield. That's tons of fun, but I would say just similar to the Restoring Light skill line option, that Illusion is kind of more focused on the group play where just more enemies, and there is kind of more, it more makes sense to have for Sorcerer a little bit more so like a support role, I would say, like with crowd control and things like that. But when you play in solo, you would need a little bit more survivability and a little bit more damage and just general utility, and so I would probably not recommend picking this for solo play, though it's again just a really nice option for group play to have a little bit more kind of crowd control role. And the last secondary skill line option to consider is Light Armor, and again just similar to Illusion, it comes only with a Valenwood expansion, so if you don't have access to that, you might consider other options, but I think this is actually the best option for Sorcerer. Light Armor is pretty unique in its way and its application. First of all, there are 7 different skill dice, and they all active, which means after you roll and resolve the die, they go to the active slots of your character. But because there is only 4 slots and there are 7 different skill dice, it's there is a lot of interesting choices going on in this line and leveling up choices. And another interesting thing about Light Armor, that unlike all other active dice that are sitting in your active slots and they are exhausted at the end of battle, this Light Armor dice, they can sit there as long as you want to, basically until you use all of the charges, or unless you willingly decide to exhaust them at your choice. But yeah, other than that, they can just sit there between battles, which is really, really handy, and essentially allowing you to just start a battle already buffed up with those Light Armor instead of just rolling them again and using many different engage actions. So Light Armor is definitely my pick for the secondary skill line, and I'm gonna put the skill line token on the last available row in our adventure mat, and the very first die that I would train is Spell Warding, which says once per turn, when engaged by an enemy, you may reduce this die by any number to prevent 1 damage. You may then recover a single Magicka type skill die equal to the level by value in which you reduce this die. So basically, here's how it works. You first roll this die and resolve it, let's say with the number 2, you put it in your active slot. Now then, when you attacked by an enemy, you may reduce this by any number you want, which is a crucial part. and in any case you will prevent still only 1 damage. However, this will also allow you to recover die from your cooldown track back to your available slots for the number that you reduced. So let's say if we have this Pulsar die, which is one of the best dice in the game really, sitting in our cooldown track, and let's say we have this Spell Warden sitting on number 4, when we engage by enemy we can choose to reduce this to a number of 1, and because the number difference between level 4 and 1 is 3, we can then recover die of level 3. So that is how it works, and it's absolutely amazing. Not only it provides you a little bit of extra defense, which is very important for our character because there is not much defense going on otherwise, it's a pretty squishy character. You can also recover your dice. Obviously, recovering Pulsar is probably the best thing you can do because it's a reusable die, it's not drain die, so you can roll it over and over again. Though sometimes it's of course not possible to have enough charges on your Spell Warden, but other than that you can recover your basic skill shock, your level 1 die. In any case, it's just you're pretty much always happy to recover die whenever you can and prevent and damage both effects in a single die, level 1 die. I think this is just amazing in yeah. Just my absolutely top pick for this skill line. Because it's not a starting skill line and it doesn't come with 2 level 1 dice right away, which means you can get to a level 4 die with a lesser amount of dice in total. You can have it just by having level 1, 2, 3 and 4, just one after another. So this is kind of a good thing. However, in this particular case, I'm still happy to take another level 1 die, even though we can already train a level 2 dice. Yeah, it's just so good, and that is Grace, which says once per move action you may reduce the die by 1 to add your magicka to your stamina when determining the number of hexes you may move. And this is exactly the reason why we're so nice and chilling sitting at just 2 stamina, which obviously isn't enough for most other classes because otherwise the mobility would be so limited. But thankfully to this die you can add the number of your magicka stat tokens to your stamina. So for example, in this case, let's say this is the Grace dice that we trained sitting in active slot. We can reduce this by any number, so from 1 it would be to 0, so it would go to the cooldown track, and then we can add magicka stats, which in this case is 3, to basically increase the stamina when it comes to movement, so we could move by 5. And this is absolutely amazing because we can just safely train more magicka and almost completely forget about stamina in most other cases. And because we're gonna train magicka all the way to 4 and probably even 5, that means we can potentially have 7 movement even though we just have 2 stamina. And yeah, this is just so good. Another super flexible die that can just allow us to save a little bit more on the training. We can instead maybe invest a little bit more heavily in health if we choose to do so. And yeah, just super helpful to loot some treasures that are far away or kite enemies to move them away, especially when you play in solo or when you need to explore some delves and you just rush in and yeah, just mobility is great, and having that option by not investing more experience into stamina, just a really good. Now moving on to the level 2, we have the options of evocation and enchant weapon. And enchant weapon says when engaging in any battle form other than magicka, and that's basically, you don't need to read anything further than that because we are most likely not going to be engaging in any other battle form other than magicka, because we would definitely want to use magicka all the time, because when we start turning magicka we gain more tenacity and all our skill dice are magicka. So yeah, and once you pass the point where you have already enough skill dice in magicka, you're probably not even gonna roll the basic combo die, so we're probably gonna untrain them. So yeah, unfortunately just enchant weapon doesn't apply to this particular character. And that essentially leaves us with just a single option of having evocation on level 2, which says reduce this die by 1 to increase a different light armor die in any adventure active slot by 1. So essentially you put this, let's say, with the number 2 here, and let's say I have this Spell Warden sitting on number 1, so I can reduce my evocation by any number. Let's say I can reduce it just by 1 to increase this one by 1. So that is how it works. You can alter in one die to changing the side of the other die. Frankly, this is not my favorite light armor die, but since enchant weapon just doesn't apply to this character whatsoever, I think this is the only option. Yeah, we kind of have to pick this one to move her next to the level 3. Moving on to the level 3, we have again an option of 2 dice to train. It's either Annulment or Prodigy. Prodigy says, during the adventure rest step, you may reduce this die by 1 to heal for additional 1 health and recover 1 additional die. This is definitely a very nice to have effect, however it's probably not the best one for Sorcerer, because as I already mentioned, especially by the mid or late game, you just don't need that much healing between turns or between days. Sometimes I even skip the adventure rest altogether simply because I'm sitting at full health pretty much all the time, so I'm not benefiting from recovering additional health. And the same comes with the recovering dice, because we have Power Surge that can very effectively recover dice, and because we have also the class ability that can recover any skill die from cooldown, I just don't think this is very beneficial specifically for this class. On the other hand, the other option, Annulment, is an absolutely amazing die. It says you may reduce the die by 1 to prevent 1 true damage, reduce it by 2 to ignore gaining a status die, or reduce by 3 to ignore all of a non-quest enemy skill, either when engaging or when being engaged. So essentially, you're reducing it 1 to prevent true damage, 2 to ignore any status die, and 3 to kinda apply fear, in a sense, because you're ignoring all enemies, their skills, by either being engaged or when you are engaging. And I just love this one particular effect. There are just so many nasty enemy skills that you would absolutely love to ignore, things like Shatter or Intimidate that applying fear on you, or Bane or Stalwart, lots of different things that you would like, I would definitely like to remove this. And keep in mind that we have this die that can kind of have a similar purpose, because this particular side applies fear, and yeah, this can help, but it's just a single die that is get drained. And this, however, Annulment, you can roll it over and over and reduce it and apply it multiple times. So yeah, just absolutely amazing thing to get over those Stalwart and other really nasty affixes. So yeah, definitely gonna train Annulment here. And lastly, we have another interesting choice. Even though we have just a single level 4 die, there is an option whether to train this at all or do some other combinations that we'll get in a moment. So first of all, let's see what concentration does. It says before you engage, you may reduce the die by 1 to add 2 enemy combat dice to your roll, even if in Magicka. These dice deal damage to your target. First of all, this effect adds enemy combat dice and not your combat dice, which are different in white, which means you can just safely untrain your combat dice if you want to and still get the effect of concentration, because you just add those black dice instead. And I would say on average, one extra enemy combat die. It adds probably 1 damage, so but by rolling 2 of them, you're essentially adding on average plus 2 damage, which is actually pretty decent. If you probably notice that destruction skill line isn't that heavy hitting, sometimes you deal like 4, 2, maybe 6 damage, but there is very unlikely to, one-shot some very high health, high defensive enemies. However, this concentration skill can allow you to push it a little bit further, because you add in 2 extra dice, which can sometimes, even result in extra 4 damage if you get very lucky. So yeah, I would say this is a really nice damage dealing option, and I will just show you some different combinations, but for now, let's just think that we're gonna add this concentration over here. And if we go this route, this essentially allows us to train only 1 single extra skill die, either from this skill line or from another skill line. And so what other potentially single die can be very beneficial to us, either from this skill line or another? And I think there is an option, and that is Legerdemain. The Legerdemain skill line has just a single level 1 skill dice, and they are very unique in their application. You roll them every time you make a lockpick check, and you just can essentially increase or decrease any number for 1 value without adding light fatigue to your cooldown track. Keep in mind that this is another skill line that is available only in the Valenwood expansion. It doesn't come with the base game, and frankly, got to be honest, that I was a little bit skeptical about this skill line at first. However, once I start playing this, especially more in solo, I can start to appreciate this even more, because there are just so many lockpick checks in the game, not only when you're trying to unlock caches, And remember, caches are very important, especially early game when you're trying to get as many glyphs, as many enchantments as you can. But also in the mid game and late game, there are just so many rules and delve tiles that occasionally just forcing you to lockpick check. And because you can adjust in the rolls or lockpick result by 1 without adding light fatigue, it can on average save you from 3 to 4 light fatigue from adding to your cooldown track. So I think this is a really helpful little die. Just because it's a single die, it doesn't ask you to for a big investment in experience. It doesn't require a lot of space on your adventure map. I think this can be a really good choice, especially if you are going for the level 4 die in your light armor. So in that case, there's kind of one option to train a level 4 die in the light armor and then fill up the rest with Ledger Domain level 1 locksmith die. However, there is also another option. Let me just for a moment untrain this die as well as the entire skill line, and let's say instead of the level 4 die of the light armor skill dice, we can actually get back to Daedric Summoning. If you remember, I mentioned earlier that there is just one particular skill die that is very helpful for our build, and spoiler alert, this is not even a summon. So as you might already guessed, I'm talking about the level 2 die called Power Stone, which says you might change the result of up to X other skill dice you've rolled to disengage to a side of your choice. And essentially it just gives a lot of consistency in your roll results. Let's say when you want to roll this Wall of Elements, you just can safely change it to this particular die, to this particular phase of the Fear status effect instead of the Maim or Daze. The same, let's say for your best pulsar die, you can change it to the area damage instead of a single target damage. It's just so much nicer to be able to reroll, not just reroll, but to change to a die result of your choice. Or let's say if you really want to get, deal a lot of damage with this level 4 die and also get healed, and you definitely don't want to roll a miss, this is your chance. Yeah, just lots of different things that you would absolutely love to use that. So yeah, a super powerful skill. It's a level 2 die, however, so first we need to train a level 1 die. So now let me put the Daedric Summoning skill line token on the token slot. And for the level 1 skill die, we have two options of either Daedric Curse or Bound Armaments. I must say that I quite like the way Bound Armaments work. It's kind of thematic that you give in allies an extra action, you buffing them. However, because it requires a different battle form than Magicka, and we want to spend pretty much all the time in Magicka, all engage actions and want to finish and start the turn in Magicka to gain tenacity from our class ability, this just unfortunately doesn't apply. So our only frankly option is Daedric Curse, which says on the one side deal X true damage to an adjacent enemy, on the other face it deals 1 true damage to an adjacent enemy, and then any single adventurer may trigger one of their class ability that costs 2 tenacity or less for free. Now when you read this for the first time, the fact that it deals damage only to adjacent enemy, that kind of seems a little bit weird and kind of awkward, because you are a ranged damage dealing class and you want ideally just standing safely in the distance, casting spells, so this kind of feel a little bit almost anti-synergy in a way. However, there are many more opportunities to deal damage to adjacent enemies that you might initially anticipate. For example, when there are just loads of enemies and they obviously coming towards you, you sometimes inevitably having at least one enemy adjacent to you, maybe not on the very first turn, but kind of pretty soon, I would say, especially in tight spaces like delves, or sometimes you just begin the clash in the middle of the clash for some like quest rules, and yeah, just different options. Or sometimes maybe when you use your pulsar die and you apply blind yourself and you don't want to get rid of this straight away, maybe you just don't have enough tenacity to use Unholy Knowledge, or maybe you prefer to spend your tenacity on Dark Exchange instead. So yeah, there's just different use cases where deal damage to adjacent enemies, and so in those cases you're very happy to have this extra die that deals true damage, and true damage is a good damage. It's frankly not the best die for our particular setup, but again, remember that we just want to have Power Stone, and this is the level 1 die, Daedric Curse, is just the way to get to the Power Stone. This is what we really want to train. And so obviously at this stage you would love to have a little bit more other stats as well at cooldown. Let's say a minimum of 4, but ideally 5 would be even better. Although I should probably mention that, unlike some other classes and especially some other skill lines, you're kind of okay to have a little bit sitting on the cooldown of 4 instead of 5. So 5 is not mandatory, it's like a very late end game, but even 4 is still a very decent and completely playable on this particular character. Now health, obviously 4 is just not enough for the late game, even though you might have a lot of ways to kind of mitigate damage and recover. Sometimes you're just having like, true damage. So yeah, just having a little bit of extra, I would say at least 6 is much more safer. The same goes for your magic stat. You need at least 4, I would say, as a bare minimum. If you really want to, you can, in the very late game, or even if you feel comfortable, you can already untrain some of the combat dice, because you can't even roll them in defensive form once you trained your light armor, because they would compete for the active slots. And so yeah, even at this point, I would say it's okay to train a little bit of extra stamina just to be able to move a little bit further, even without relying on the light armor stat. And this is pretty much the build. Pretty decent damage. Remember, this is a level 4 die. It scales with the number of available die in your adventure mat. So with this combination, it would deal 11 damage, because it doesn't count its own. So there's like 11 other dice sitting available slots. Of course, most of the times, most of these light armors, they would be probably sitting in your active slots and not in available slots, but still sometimes you have this opportunity to just deal a crazy amount of damage, and of course a little bit of true damage here and there, and blind is just absolutely ridiculously good, and some abilities to shut down enemy skills. There are nasty abilities with fear die from this die, as well as from level 3 of the light armor. So we are just very decent, well-rounded build, especially combined with all the strength of the Sorcerer class abilities, especially on the master side. Things like Dark Exchange and Blood Magic and Power Surge. Just lots of flexibility in this build, lots of mobility thanks to the combination of combining your magic stat to your stamina stat when determines movement. So yeah, lots of good things in this build. And lastly, I would like to mention a couple of really nice items that can work pretty nicely for this particular character and this build. And the first one is Oak Lightning Staff, which says after rolling this engage, you may reroll any one skill die. You may choose whether to overattack this weapon after rolling. Now, some of the die on this character can be a little bit hit or miss. For example, things like Wall of Elements, where there are 3 different sides, and if you would roll another one, not that you want, you would still drain this die, what can be, sometimes it can be a little bit unfortunate. So, and just there's just many other, of course, implications, and yeah, just re-rolling the die after each engage is absolutely huge, and I'm really surprised that this is not a legendary item, it's just a normal common item. So yeah, if you have a chance to take this, definitely keep it safe from all those stealing enemies, keep it safely in your pack, not in the ready slots, and the same for the shatter ability of the enemies. So yeah, absolutely amazing stuff, and I would keep it for the entire game if I can. Next is very similar, Silver Circlet. It says, spend to Tenacity, Interrupt. After rolling, change a single level 1 or level 2 skill die to the side of your choice. This again, a little bit similar to Oak Lightning Staff. It gives you a little bit more control, more consistency over your rolls. And even though it works only on level 1 or level 2 skill dice, remember that you can change level 2 die Power Stone of your Daedric Summoning skill line, which can then change the other even level 4 skill die, for example, like Ancient Knowledge. So yeah, it's just a really good skill, a really good item to have in your toolkit for like all purposes really. There are lots of different things. Even the level 1 die, sometimes, it gains 2 tenacity, sometimes it deals 4 damage, sometimes 2 damage, and you definitely want to have more control over which result you get. And unlike even Oak Lightning Staff, it allows you to choose the side, choose the side of your die, which is obviously even more powerful. So yeah, really good accessory, especially for this build. Next is a worm called Sabatons. It's a legendary feat, piece of armor, says prevent 1 damage or recover 1 Magicka type skill die. Now, it goes without saying how powerful it is. You can either prevent 1 damage, which I'm pretty much always happy to take, or recover some Magicka type skill die. It doesn't even specify which level, which means it can work on any level. You can recover Pulsar after every engage, which means you can roll it every time. Absolutely huge item. Obviously legendary, and yeah, obviously you have pretty much no control over the how you can, whether you will see these items in the game, but whenever you see this in a shop or somewhere, definitely buy this one. Next is another similar effect, Silver Dawn Jacket. It's a legendary chest which says prevent 1 damage or recover 1 thief skill die type. Obviously we don't care about those types of dice, but however for preventing 1 damage this is amazing, and there is no other requirements like spending tenacity or anything, it's just passive 1 damage reduction. And keep in mind that because these are 2 different item pieces, chest and feet, they have different traits, which means they can have different parts of your body. Those effects stack, which means after each engage, you can either, choose to collectively prevent 2 damage or prevent 1 damage and recover 1 magic skill type. Die are absolutely great. Next we have another chest, Homespun Jerkin. It says reduce your tenacity by 1 to prevent 1 damage. This obviously is not as powerful as Silver Dawn Jack because you can't it's not quite a passive effect, you still need to pay some resource. In this case you spend tenacity to prevent damage, but I would say Sorcerer is probably the best class to wear this item because there's just no shortage of tenacity, you gain 1 for free, so this is not that bad I would say. And even though obviously you can't wear 2 chests at the same time, again because items are kind of random in the way, in the nature how they work in this game, whenever you see any of these items, you're pretty much always happy to pick either of them. And of course if you get the Silver Dawn Jack first, this is your jackpot, but yeah, other than that, Homespun Jerkin is a really good alternative. Next is a slightly different item, is a Wolf Pelt. It says when you would gain a status die, if you are in magic battle form, you may choose to gain 1 light fatigue instead of the status die. Now you are obviously spending most of your time, or I would say all of your time in magic battle form, so this effect always applies. And there are sometimes really nasty enemies, maybe you have multiple enemies with Bane, or some of them with Fear. I believe it's called Intimidate, this enemy skill. So yeah, sometimes you just can't remove status die from your cooldown on your own using Unholy Knowledge, and this is why this pelt is just a saver. And the last item, which is a bit more in a fun category I would say, is a Conjurer's Potion, which says expand. While performing and engage in magic battle form, select any untrained Daedric summoning skill die and freely add it to your engage. When the skill die would be exhausted or drained, returning to the supply. So basically, whenever you engage in Magicka, and you're always engaging in magic battle form, you can add another Daedric summoning skill die, and there is one particular level 3 skill die which summons the summon companions, which is really strong, especially since you already have the level 2 die, which allows you to reroll the die to set the die of the face of you want. It's just a really fun combination of occasionally having Daedric summoning companions without having that skill. It's really fun, and yeah, even though potions are obviously one-time use in a battle, you can sometimes expand and refill them on the alchemy station. So yeah, this is not the item I would grab right away, but it can be really fun, and yeah, I like it and I had a lot of fun with it. Just to give you a sense of how this class feels and plays, I created this a little kind of demo clash battle, if you will, to show you a little bit of this in action, of actually rolling a die and giving a little bit of thought process of how things go. And there are a couple of things to keep in mind about this. First of all, I apologize that not the entire clash mat fits into the screen. That's just unfortunately the limitation of my current setup. I've also calculated the experience that I used to upgrade my character to this stage, and that should be, the number is 33, hopefully it's correct. Keep in mind that I slightly reduced the cooldown from 5 down to 4 to kind of make it a little bit more realistic. And so, because my experience is 33 and I'm playing as solo, that means my enemy pool is also 33. And so I pulled the random enemies, which are level 20 Wood Elf Deadeye, really kind of strong and dangerous gentleman. Have a level 10 Wrath of Crows. Elusive, really nasty, which means you can't target it unless you start a turn adjacent. And there are 3 level enemies. Skewer Pup, with everyone's favorite Rot. We have a Wolf with the Riposte, which means it's reflecting the damage back essentially. And we have a Wood Elf Bandit with Dodge. Also keep in mind this clash battle doesn't have any particular rules like you would normally expect in certain encounters, so this makes things a little bit easier. However, to kind of balance things out, I'm starting completely blank with no items, no other enchantments or things like that, and even all of my light armor dice are available and not in the active slots like you would normally start, which means I would need to make an extra engage, and extra engage means extra light fatigue in my cooldown track. So yeah, I hope this balances things out a little bit, because normally at this stage of the game you would definitely have some strong items, hopefully some armor, hopefully some weapon that you could use, and they generally help a lot. I don't have any of that, but yeah, I hope that this can still give you like a little rough idea at least how it works. Okay, with that out of the way, I think we're good to start, and it's a round 1, beginning of my turn. I don't have any dice to recover, and I'm gaining 1 free tenacity thanks to my Sorcerer's innate ability, because I'm starting a turn in magic battle form. And just to give like a thought process of how I would approach this, I think the most deadly enemy currently on the board is this Wood Elf Deadeye, because they have range of 6, so no matter where they move they can basically just reach me. And yeah, with 4 combat dice this looked a bit scary frankly, so I would love to target them first. But because I have only 4 magicka, that means I need to move closer, which is frankly a little bit unfortunate. I would rather prefer to stay away and shoot in the range, but because this ranged unit is so far away, that means I must basically just jump into the whole battlefield. And yeah, this frankly look a bit scary, so yeah. As my first action, I'm just moving, you know what, I'm just gonna move 1 step over here towards the skewer pup. Now the question is, what dice will I use for engagement targeting this Wood Elf Deadeye? And there is a little bit of dilemma. This my die, the Ancient Knowledge from level 4 instruction stuff skill line, it deals the most damage while all other dice are available, which means now is the perfect opportunity to strike. However, this dice can also heal me for the amount of damage dealt, so this kind of dice for recovery, for emergency when you're low on health, you would love to use that. So this is a tough choice, but I think I'm gonna use this now. And because this dice has two sides of misses, I'm probably gonna use this alongside my Daedric Summoning Power Stone to hopefully adjust it to the side that I need. For this engagement, I'm also gonna use Wall of Elements dice, because remember that you can apply this those debuffs basically to any other units in range. It doesn't have to be the target, so if things go well and this die will hopefully defeat a Wood Elf with just 1 go, I can still apply these targets to other debuffs to other units. And I'll be using some defense because I'm definitely gonna need this one. Okay, so I'm using these 4 dice, targeting Wood Elf Deadeye, and let's see how it goes. Alright, that's actually not too bad, wow. This is actually amazing. So first of all, I'm resolving this die. And this die deals 1 damage for each available magicka skill die, and I have currently 4 and 4, so that is 8 available dice. Wow, this is absolutely ridiculous. And 8 damage, Wood Elf Deadeye has 5 health and 3 defense, which means this is just enough to defeat it with 1 go. Wow, absolutely ridiculous. So this goes here because it's drained, it's no longer recovered, but understandably so, it's so strong. Next, I'm gonna resolve this die. And this side is actually fear, so I don't even need to change it to anything, or should I? Now, I think those abilities aren't that bad, honestly. And you know what, I should probably use my Daedric Summoning Stone to change this, in this particular case, to daze, because I think this can save me a little bit more health in this case. So yeah, I'm resolving this die like that to change this die to this side, and that means I'm also resolving this, and I'm drain this, and I'm applying 2 daze statuses to this Wrath of Crows and to Wolf, because they are the hard-hitting enemies. And the last one is just 1 little defense. Unfortunately, this is the lowest number you can get, but hey, can't complain. I'm also gonna make a second engagement, which means I'm gaining 2 light fatigue, because I'm playing on the expert difficulty, and for this one I want to target Wolf, and I'm gonna apply my damage over time. Really like this die. I'm also gonna have this blind, which I don't mind getting blind since I'm adjacent to enemies anyway, and I also want to roll a little bit more of my light armor die. So that's 4 dice targeting Wolf. Let's go. And wow, this is actually amazing. First of all, I'm resolving this die, and Wolf is getting 2 true damage, and they would also deal 1 true damage to all adjacent enemies, and Such a shame there are no adjacent enemies in this case. And this enemy gains blind, and I will get blind as well at the end of the engagement. So this die is resolved. Next, I'm gonna apply this die on the wolf as well. So there's lots of things going on here on this poor wolf, as well as I'm applying these 2 dice, moving them to my active slots. So really good results actually. And taking this opportunity, I'm just gonna right away change this die, reduce this to from 3 back to 1, to increase this one to 3. Yeah, I think this is the end of my turn. I could make one more engagement, but I think I'm just gonna leave it like that, with the exception that I also need to get blind status myself at the end of the engagement because of this die. And alright, that's the end of my turn. Now enemy's turn, starting with the highest Wrath of Crow, and they just move closer towards me, and they cannot attack because of the days. This is really good. Same with the wolf. It actually doesn't even move. He tries to attack Wrath of Crows because it's the highest health enemy, adjacent enemy. Remember, because of blind, they're all treating enemies as enemies, basically as opposing units. But because the Wrath of Crows wasn't adjacent, or was it? Oh yeah, actually, it was adjacent when the wolf turn started. So yeah, so wolf is now rolling 2 combat die against this Wrath of Crows. And wow, 4 damage. This is the best as you can get, obviously. And 2 damage to Wrath of Crows. Just like that. Now Skewer Pup engages targeting me with 1 enemy combat die. That is 1 damage that I'm just blocking with this armor. And I can also recover level 1 die. I probably don't even need this, frankly. Yeah, so I'm good like that. And also Wood Elf Bandit just making 2 steps closer towards me. Yeah, I think that they will try to attack from this hex. So yeah, and that was the end of enemy's turn. So that means it's the beginning of a new round. Round 2. I'm recovering these 4 dice, moving Light Fatigue to the supply, and moving these dice back, just like so. And I'm also gaining 1 free tenacity thanks to the Sorcerer innate ability. Now, because now I am adjacent to this Wrath of Crows, I don't mind using this level 1 Daedric Summoning skill that allows me to deal damage to adjacent enemies. That's actually when it's useful. And since I'm already blinded, I don't mind using this Pulsar again, alongside 2 basic Daedric Summoning, Destruction stuff, skill lines. So yeah, let's see how it goes. I'm targeting Wrath of Crows, and that is, wow, this is actually an amazing result. So this is 2 true damage and 2 more true damage, and that is just enough to defeat the Crow. Wow, absolutely ridiculous. True damage, love it. Frankly, I can't use this anymore. That was my only available target since I was blinded. It was the closest adjacent enemies with the most amount of health. So yeah, these 2 dice I just go to my cooldown track. They are exhausted. And that is the end of my turn. Don't want to do anything else. And yeah, of course, at the end of my engage, I should have put the blind status again, so it's kind of basically refreshing in my cooldown track. And yeah, I completely forgot that at this point I should have already removed the days status from Wolf. Alright, so it's now enemy turn, and the wolf is moving towards me. And yeah, because it's blind, even though it's blinded, so it could have attacked some opposing units, which means it could target other units as well. But because blind is targeting only the strongest enemy, and which is me in this case, it's still targeting me regardless of blindness. So this is a little bit unfortunate. So 2 combat dice on me. This is 3. A bit unfortunate, but I'm gonna soak 1 damage using light armor skill, and I think I'm gonna take 2 damage. This is fine actually. Next, Skewer Pup engages me with 1 combat die, and that is, I should have reroll it. Yeah, wow, that's it got even worse, but this is fine. I'm taking 1 damage, reducing it here, and taking 1 hit. So I'm now down at 3 health, which is still fine, and you'll see why in a moment. And now finally we have Wood Elf Bandit making 2 steps over here, and also engaging me with 1 combat die for 1 damage. That is the beginning of round 2, and I apologize, my bad, I completely forgot that after defeating Wrath of Crows, with this ability I should have gained this over fatigue, which I believe should have been put after the blind status, but before this one. So yeah, this is now the beginning of round 3. I'm recovering 4 of these dice and going back to their allocating slots. I'm also getting 1 free tenacity, as always, from my class ability, and now I'm spending 3 tenacity to do Dark Exchange, which means I'm spending 3 tenacity, and now I'm moving 2 health chips from Wolf, which happen to be the last health chips, which means Wolf is no longer here, and I'm moving them actually not in the supply, but under my character, so this is why it's so good. And because this Wolf is no longer here, it is defeated, this damage over time thing jumps on the next adjacent enemy, which is Skewer Pup, and Skewer Pup takes 2 true damage as well. So yeah, this is really nice. Next, because I'm still blinded, I can't really move away to attack them from the distance, which means I can only attack adjacent enemies, and because I can only attack adjacent strongest enemy, which in this case is Wood Elf Bandit, I don't really have much choice, but other than just, yeah, attack Wood Elf Bandit. And sorry, I just realized that you probably can't see this properly, so let me move it a little bit closer like that. Okay, so I'm engaging the Wood Elf Bandit with this just 4 dice, and let's see what we get. Okay, this is actually not that bad. First of all, I'm going to resolve the Pulsar die, which means I'm dealing 2 true damage to the Wood Elf Bandit. True damage there. A bit unfortunate, but I'm also taking 1 true damage because it deals with damage to all adjacent units, and units are adventurers as well. And it also means this Skewer Pup is defeated, so it taking 1 damage. And because Skewer Pup is defeated, this thing jumps on Wood Elf Bandit and he takes 2 more true damage. That's some chain reaction going on there from a single die. That's really hilarious. Because Skewer Pup is defeated, I'm gaining another rot, which is a little bit nasty. I think it goes to my cooldown right after this die. So it goes straight up like that. Next, I'm gonna use the effect of Power Stone to change the die of my choice to the side if I want. So I'm definitely gonna use this one to deal 2 more true damage to the last Wood Elf Bandit. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And that finishing him off, and that finishing off the battle. All of these 3 die. I'm also gaining 1 tenacity, by the way. So yeah, this die go to my cooldown track. This die is recovered, I believe, so it goes back to my adventurer mat. And yeah, so this is like how this character plays and feels. I could have, if I want to, recover some extra dice with my power surge, but I don't really need this. And yeah, maybe in a turn or 2 I could use Dark Exchange to basically heal back to 3 health. This rot is a little bit unfortunate, but there's not much way around it when you deal with this kind of enemies that have this effect. Yeah, other than that, I think this is pretty much it. And that's a wrap for today's video. These class guides take quite a bit of time and effort to put together, so if you found this video helpful, please give it a like and subscribe for more board gaming content. And if you would like to support the channel directly, you can also do this over on Patreon, and it really means a lot to me. And well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.